War is chaos. Anyone unfortunate enough to have experienced it on the front lines would likely tell you just as such. But war is also, rather paradoxically, quite organised. Think about it. The structures are efficient, it's all about logistics, even the uniforms are kept pristine. And you know what else? War has pretty strict rules. You might not think so, but in a war, a soldier can't simply do whatever they want, at least not legally. Many soldiers, of course, still commit atrocities, what we mostly refer to as war crimes. There are wars against things like looting, targeting of civilians, and even certain infrastructure that can carry very heavy penalties if broken. International conventions in the aftermath of World War II, like the Geneva Conventions of 1949, are the pillars on which modern international laws of armed conflict are built upon. But that all begs a question. These changes were all brought about after the Second World War. So what about before? What rules existed back then, if any? How did concepts like the targeting of civilians, medics, or looting apply on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific? The 40s were a very different world to our own, and so understanding the military customs and cultures of the time allows us to recognise certain militaries' actions for what they were at the time, not just how we'd view them today. So, back in the day, what were the rules? Well, thankfully, there were some, and to understand the state of international and humanitarian law when World War II broke out, we need to look, as always, at some history. The foundations of what would become international law and the laws of war would be laid out in Geneva in 1864. Among other things, it focused on protecting wounded soldiers on the battlefield and created the International Humanitarian Organization known as the Red Cross. Even back then, people were seeing the suffering increasingly industrialized war would cause, and so when advocates like Swiss businessman Henri Dunant stepped forward with ideas of creating international relief organizations, people and governments were quick to get on board. The First Geneva Convention was born. As these movements gathered steam, they would eventually be further built upon. The Hague Regulations were a set of treaties that took place in 1899 and 1907, which represent our next major milestone. There were 26 countries who acted as founding signatories, and in 1907 that number grew to 44. The world had seen the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, which is historically considered something of a prelude to the First World War. Trench warfare, mass infantry assaults, and war crimes galore meant that the international community were seeing these organisations as a better and better idea. And given how the First World War was right around the corner, they may have been pretty smart to listen to those instincts. Then, during the interwar period, the League of Nations was founded, and in 1922, two more Geneva Conventions were adopted, one revising the wounded and sick regime, and a new convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. And as far as the laws of war were concerned, that's what we had by the time Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939. A quick and interesting side note, some contemporary historians are starting to consider Japan's invasion of China in 1937 as the official beginning of World War II. Some even put it back as far as the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. History is an ever-sliding kaleidoscope, and it's interesting to see the more European-centric view on history challenged. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments either way. But for now, we're going to ease into 1939. So, given the rules of 1939, what did the rules of war actually look like? What were you allowed and not allowed to do? Well, civilians had protections against murder, pillage, and wanton destruction. Private property was to be respected, and occupiers of territories had to maintain order and respect local law. Soldiers had to distinguish themselves from civilians, and those who surrendered couldn't be killed. The wounded, regardless of what side they were on, were to be cared for, with the Red Cross emblem being an international symbol of medical protection. And POWs had to be treated well, with adequate living conditions, food, and medical treatment. They were not to be tortured or killed. Certain weapons were banned, like asphyxiating gases after the horrors of World War I, as well as dum-dum bullets that expand upon impact, as well as weapons that just caused unnecessary suffering. Neutral states were to be respected, and collective punishment was strictly banned. Now, you might consider this as something of a joke when you think about the fact that every single one of these laws was broken by at least one side of World War II, but for now, let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail, and also outline where the interesting cases are, those grey areas that are bound to appear during something as chaotic as war, especially war with rules to follow. So, civilians were supposed to be saved from murder, pillage, and wanton destruction. The numbers vary based on sources, but many believe the number of civilians killed during World War II is between 40 and 55 million. It's safe to say that civilians weren't merely collateral damage, they were themselves targeted often, as the home front was critical to all sides' war efforts. Murder for murder's sake was also rampant. The millions of civilians killed during the Holocaust by Nazi Germany is the most egregious example of civilian murder in history. And on the Allies' side, you've got Dresden, the bombings of Tokyo and Hiroshima, Nagasaki, which also killed many civilians too. The strategic necessity of these actions and their targeting of military infrastructure within civilian zones is the core around which a modern debate about these events has formed. Because if the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are considered in one's opinion to have been critical to the ending of the war early, for example, and the saving of countless American lives, then they're considered militarily justifiable even if scores of Japanese civilians were killed. But some contemporary opinions report that if the US had communicated more strongly that the Japanese could keep their emperor, which they did anyway once the war was over, then the Japanese soldiers were much more likely to lay down their arms for good. If you subscribe to this interpretation, then the atomic bombings were unjustified and even potentially in violation of international law. Let's not even talk about the wanton destruction that was undertaken as part of these events. I think we can throw collective punishment into the wood chipper here as well. And then you have pillage, or as we know it today, looting. Soldiers certainly weren't allowed to do that. Or were they? Well, pillage was absolutely a crime, but it wasn't strictly enforced. And there's a question about what counts as pillage. Often, during war, taking things like weapons could have a strategic advantage. You deprive the enemy of it and gain it for yourself, which made it permissible under the rules of war at the time. That, though, isn't pillaging or looting. US soldiers, known as GIs, did this so much that the US government had to set up a whole formal bureaucracy around bringing captured weapons home as keepsakes. So-called bring-back papers had to be filled out in order to bring back certain souvenirs, like flags and helmets, but mostly it was reserved for weapons. This had a few goals. It kept US morale high by letting the boys take some guns home, and it made sure that they were registered so they got there. The papers were also supposed to legitimize these items, although what the difference was between legally captured and stolen property was quite blurry, and whilst the bureaucracy was set up to distinguish and prevent illegal looting of civilian property, it did struggle in practice to do so. The US also did more than just let troops take things home with their personal effects, though. Crates full of war trophies were shipped and flown back to the US, all stamped and catalogued. There was a whole logistical process for mailing trophies back home. And it wasn't just weapons, as you could make the argument that at least soldiers had earned those in the valour and bravery of battle. There were other things soldiers took that would characterise illegal looting, because civilian homes were ransacked for souvenirs. Soldiers' gear like helmets or bayonets, flags and propaganda items, maps, art, photographs, wine from cellars, anything fancy or novel enough to risk taking it home, would be. This also included darker items like wedding bands and other jewellery, enemy soldiers' personal letters, and even body parts like teeth or skulls. Military servicemen would have to justify their actions in all kinds of ways by claiming military necessity, an opportunity for profit, a harmless trinket or keepsake, and even just straight-up revenge. Looting was a big problem across all of the powers fighting in World War II. Despite pillage being a crime, it was tolerated by most officers, which created a culture of permissiveness around it. According to war correspondent Ernie Pyle and his book Brave Men, a common adage heard among the troops was, quote, "The Germans fight for glory, the British fight for their homes, and the Americans fight for souvenirs." It wasn't just the US on the Allies' side, though. When the USSR invaded Poland at the same time as Nazi Germany in 1939, they tore it apart with the fighting and looting. British soldiers had stricter rules around looting, but it still surely occurred. Of course, on the Axis side, the Nazis were notorious for the sheer amount of goods they stole. Cultural artifacts, businesses, jewellery, gold, valuables, cash, basically anything they could get their hands on was pilfered. Many of the ghettos where Jews were being forced to stay prior to the introduction of the final solution were raided for their belongings and people. They were stolen from as individuals and collectively. Protecting local law and order didn't work out so well either, between all the mass looting, pillaging, murder, SA and much more. Civilian populations were treated pretty brutally by soldiers across the board. The respecting local law part is actually quite interesting because if you look at Nazi Germany, for example, the systematic murder of Jews was written into German law, which stripped them of their rights. So evidently there was some common sense attached in terms of how this rule was acted on. For the most part, soldiers did wear their uniforms or variations of their uniforms to identify themselves and the enemy. It was sometimes common for soldiers who were fleeing to don civilian clothes as they thought that they would be treated better as a civilian than a POW, but that feels like a fringe case. There are plenty of examples of surrendering soldiers being killed. This was particularly common amongst the Japanese in the Pacific, who saw surrendering as weakness in their enemies, but again, this was observed at least in part across almost all fighting nations in World War II. The wounded on both sides as well were certainly not cared for. Don't get me wrong, some certainly were, and many fighting armies did observe the Red Cross as a symbol not to target something, but take the example of the Japanese again, where the US GIs were so afraid of Japanese soldiers either waking up wounded or pretending to be dead and blowing themselves up with grenades, that it would be common practices to bayonet or shoot laying down soldiers who looked dead just in case they weren't. And if you look at the various massacres on all sides on the Eastern Front, where double tapping the dead and dying was sometimes seen as a cheaper and less risky alternative to keeping prisoners. And in some theatres, especially the Pacific, medics and marked facilities were often fired on despite protections, leading many to reduce or outright remove their insignia. The compliance on the Western Front was generally better, as the war wasn't one of total annihilation as it was elsewhere, but even there, medics and Red Cross facilities were targeted from time to time. POWs were required to be treated well, not tortured or killed. They were to be instead given food, medical treatment, and adequate living conditions. Many nations, though, fighting in World War II, couldn't give their own soldiers these things, so they certainly weren't going to give them to the enemy, wounded or captured. The Japanese probably treated prisoners of war the worst of any nation, with death rates in Japanese POW camps being as high as 33%, when in German camps it was more like 4%. However, I'm certain every country must have broken this rule at some point or another, whether they were deliberately trying to or not. The Japanese in particular, though, did take pride in the cruel and unusual punishments they would dole out to POWs, whether it was malnutrition, disease, exposure, and neglect, or more active things like beating, traumatizing, mutilating, and humiliating. Gases were banned on the battlefield, but the Third Reich infamously used Zyklon B in gaseous form to exterminate millions of people. And both sides stockpiled the stuff just in case. Meanwhile, what weapons caused unnecessary suffering could also be debated. Did nuclear bombs cause unnecessary suffering? What about flamethrowers? What about mines and traps designed to injure and maim? The Japanese efforts into biological weapons research under Unit 731 also violates this one pretty hard. And as far as neutral states being respected goes, well, that depends on your designation as neutral. Officially, neutral nations like Switzerland were never attacked due to a whole host of factors like geography and military readiness of the population. But Belgium was also neutral until it was invaded in 1940, and Poland wasn't bothering anybody, even with its alliances, but they were both steamrolled by enemy armies nonetheless. For all intents and purposes, they were both neutral, and yet they were brutalized all the same. So, what does that tell us? Are humans just innately bad, and we shouldn't try to have international humanitarian laws for war because we're just going to violate them all anyway? Well, Maybe. It's a cynical way to look at it, but another way is to look at the time and place in which these laws came into their context, as well as the people who wrote them, and maybe then we can recognise that perhaps both the laws and the lawmakers were flawed. From the 1860s up until 1939, people had seen, predicted, and lived through the industrialisation of warfare. A storm of steel overhead that turned skirmishes in fields with muskets into crater-filled wastelands of death. It turned battle from something to glorify and romanticize into pure horror, where trauma and survival were the only realities for many individuals trapped in it. In this context, it made perfect sense that things like the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law gained popularity. People were scared of the future, and combined with that fear of the unknown and a genuine belief in the humanitarian progress of technology and humanity, they drew up boundaries to try and make war better, to sanitize it, to help anyone who could be affected by it. This idealism we might call naive today, to expect nations to follow certain rules because a bunch of important people sat down and agreed as such, is a little hard to believe at times. And to believe that war could somehow be made sanitized and less horrific when it's an inanely violent, traumatic thing speaks to a lot of the hubris of the people who came up with these ideas in the first place. And that might not matter all that much to the individual soldier on the front line, hence these laws getting broken so much by all sides. And the funny thing is, despite the 8 decades and change since World War II, nothing's really changed. International humanitarian law has come a long way, and we're still having the same debates about weapons, about collateral damage, civilian deaths, what counts as looting, what counts as murder, what counts as a war crime. In particular, right now, we're having a large planet-wide debate on the importance of these institutions and how well they can actually enforce their laws. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Every iteration of humanitarian law and the laws of war are better than the last. And the trend suggests more countries truly adhere to these practices now than they ever did before. In theory, each generation's version of war is moving more closely towards the ideal that those in Geneva sought all those years ago. We have nations across the world observing the ban on things like chemical weapons and landmines. Even the 2 nuclear bombs dropped on Japan in World War II are to this day the only ones ever dropped on an enemy during a conflict. That's progress, that's something. Don't be so quick to write off humanity. We, like those before us, are flying blind, doing the best we can with what we have and what we've inherited, striving for better. The fact of the matter is, laws of war both now and then are imperfect and probably always will be because they're made by us, imperfect people. Their flaws mirror our own, and each time they're violated or subverted by us, we try again to make them a little better than before. Not to render war inert, that would be impossible, but to make sure that the inevitable pain war brings can be felt less deeply and less often than it is today.